It's great to see you, and thanks so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have people coming to listen to our talk today. Perhaps you've been here before for the Jean Monnet seminar. This is our third of the term. We started off with Professor Jean-Pierre from Gothenburg University. We then moved to Andy Smith from Sciences Po Bordeaux. And I'll be introducing our speaker very, very shortly once Zoom has finished admitting people, but I can see it shot straight up to 35 in the audience just in those opening few seconds. So it looks like there's a great turnout for Professor Vasilopoulou today as well. So I'll just give it 10 more seconds whilst you're all arriving. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I can see more and more people arriving. Fantastic. That's great. Okay, well, I think we'll get started. I'm sure a couple more people will come, but we're already at our record attendance for the term with over 40 people here. So it looks like we've got an exciting talk in store. If we've not met before, my name is Dr. Paul Tobin. I'm a senior lecturer in European politics here at the University of Manchester. And we're presenting today's seminar through the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, which includes Manchester University, Manchester Metropolitan University, and the University of Chester. I'm joined by Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou, who will be chairing our Q&A at the end of the session, and Konstantinos Kanonopoulos, who is one of the excellent PhD students we have here at Manchester, who is making sure everything happens behind the scenes. But you're all here to hear from our speaker, who's going to be speaking for 20 minutes or so on one of the areas of her specialisms, which is the rise in recent years, actually I don't want to say rise, it's not for me to say, but the existence of the far right and Euroscepticism within Europe. Professor Sophia Vasilopoulou, she's one of the leading experts in Europe on this topic. She's published in the leading journals in the field in the world. I'm also very proud to say that she was my PhD supervisor, and I have very fond memories of sitting in her office during my PhD, and I'm very grateful to her for that experience and also for joining us today. So Professor Sophia Vasilopoulou, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Manchester Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to join you. Can I share my screen now? Okay, let's try to do this. Share. And can you confirm if everything looks fine?
It all looks perfect to me.
Perfect. So thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you virtually today. I should say I was at Manchester a few years ago already. I can't remember, maybe 4 or 5. And at the time I presented some of my joint work with my partner in crime, Daphne Halikiopoulou, on the Golden Dawn. So today I'm going to present again some joint work with her. But it's not going to be on the Golden Dawn specifically. It's tackling a more broader issue, broader questions, but that are also related to the far right in Europe. So the title of my presentation of our paper is Protesters versus Nationalists: Why Political Trust Prevents the Far Right from Expanding its Appeal but has a different effect on its core electorate. So seems a bit of a mouthful, but I will explain that as we go along. I should say, Paul, if I'm running out of time, do give me a shout, because I just realized I don't have a watch here.
Okay, I will do that, no problem.
Yeah. But I shouldn't really take more than 20 minutes, I don't think so. Yeah, okay. So clearly from the title, you see that the focus of this paper is on voting behavior for the far right. So we are interested in reasons that underpin the rise of this, let's say, political movement, the far right. And here in this paper, we're focusing specifically on the role of political trust. Now, what is our starting point? So there's quite a lot of literature in European politics, but also more broader comparative politics that view political trust as an indicator of stability. So generally, the assumption is, both from a normative perspective, but also from an empirical perspective, that trust is a good thing for democracy. It brings stability, it brings prosperity as well. So the flip side of that is that distrust poses essentially a threat to the established social order, and quite often high levels of distrust may lead to radicalism. So this is kind of classic theories of trust. There is quite a lot of literature that has taken this perspective and has tried to apply it on the rise of the far right. Yet what we do see in that literature is that there's no coherent finding that will tell us actually what the effect of distrust on far-right voting is. There is quite a few studies. I've named here some. You may already be familiar with some of them. For example, the Lubers et al. Article is a classic article if you're interested in far-right politics, who find a positive association, meaning people who are placing their trust in the political system, in its institutions, the economy, they're satisfied with democracy and so on, tend to vote for the far right? So this trust is positively associated. Yet there are also quite a lot of studies, again, spanning quite a few years, starting from Pippa Norris's book in 2005, which is again a seminal piece in far-right politics, and more recent work by Rodwin or Van Howard and Vakesel, who actually say, well, there is something there, but actually the findings are not very consistent, and they're certainly not consistent over time. They're certainly not consistent across cases. And quite often, they're also not consistent in terms of objects of trust. So perhaps you might find a positive association when we're looking at trust in institutions more broadly, but you might find a negative association or a no effect when you're looking at, let's say, trust in a specific object, e.g. Public services or the education system or what have you. So although there is some tendency to talk about the positive association, the empirical results are a bit mixed. So that's kind of really the underlying puzzle in this work. How can we address this issue, right? Why do we have so conflicting empirical findings? How can we conceptualize that? How can we explain that? Now, our argument in a nutshell is that, well, yes, trust does matter, and in a way it has a negative effect on far-right voting, meaning if sorry, I should have written a positive effect here, right? So if you're not trusting the institutions, you're more likely to opt for the far right. Yet what we are kind of trying to say is that we need to also differentiate between types of voters, because this association, this relationship is not quite the same across types of voters. And what we are doing is differentiating between the protesters on the one hand, who are the people with declining trust in institutions who also opt for the far right as a means of expressing their anti-establishment feelings and sentiments. These are the protesters, and the mechanism here is protest. Whereas there's another section of the electorate which is more core to the far right, what we term the nationalists, who essentially cast their vote for the far right on the basis of their nationalism and anti-immigration attitudes. And for those individuals, actually trust has no effect, is not important, is not something that comes into the voting behavior calculus. So that's the argument in a nutshell. And what I'll do in the next 10-15 minutes, I'll try to unpack the different aspects of this argument and then explain to you our empirical strategy, our empirical tests, and what we find. So let's start with perhaps my favorite slide in this talk, which tries to define political trust. And what we've done here is we've drawn upon Andreas Wimmer, his 1997 paper, who views political trust as something a little bit broader than just trust in institutions. And he defines trust as a broad framework of collective cooperation, what he terms a social contract, which involves a trade-off between individual freedoms on the one hand and collective payoffs on the other. So simply put, essentially, we as citizens are investing in the state in one way or another through paying our taxes, for instance, but amongst other things. And then as a result of that, or in response to that, we are also expecting some collective payoffs. For instance, I pay my taxes, therefore I expect a functioning educational system, for instance, right? Or I expect a functioning institutional configuration, a functioning parliament, and so on. So we take a bit of a broader definition of political trust here. And I should say again, drawing from Easton and these kinds of classic scholars, we argue that citizens tend to assess two components of this social contract. The procedural side, which is essentially diffuse support for the political system and its institutions, and substantive, specific support for institutional effectiveness, policy implementation, provision of public services, this kind of thing. So we are viewing political trust as something a bit broader, and we term it the social contract as a means of capturing this breadth of ideas. And this, I should repeat, has a procedural component which relates to diffuse support for the system, and a substantive component which relates to more to support for specific aspects of the system and policy outcomes, provision of public services, and so on. Okay, now what's the argument here? This is kind of standard comparative politics arguments, which tell you, well, actually, mainstream parties are associated with the establishment, right? They are associated with the political system in one way or another, partly because they are the ones responsible for how the political system looks, right? So if, as an individual, you are starting to become more untrustworthy or distrustful of the system, that will also mean that you are associating that with mainstream politics, because mainstream parties are the ones that have built the system as it is. So kind of classic trust theories will tell you that essentially mainstream parties and the incumbent will essentially be the ones that are going to be punished by those individuals with declining levels of trust. And who is going to be rewarded? Then that would be marginal actors or smaller actors or non-mainstream actors. We should be careful because far-right parties are not marginal actors in every European society, not anymore. But essentially, far-right parties can be beneficiaries of this process. Here, if we take the classic literature in radicalism and far-right politics, we do know that illiberalism and populism are core characteristics of the agendas, the policy agendas of these political actors. And these kinds of ideas draw upon trust-related grievances. So far-right parties politicize, if we may call it like that, questions of declining trust, be it being against the elites, the institutions, the government, and generally democratic representation if they put forward this illiberal sort of justification. So in a way, not only mainstream parties will lose out from this declining trust, but the core beneficiaries can be the far right, precisely because they politicize this issue. Here, the mechanism essentially is protest. So the people who want to go against the establishment in order to express their discontent are very likely to opt for the far right for the reasons that I outlined above. So if you want to see that in terms of hypothesis, that means that essentially individuals with high levels of trust in institutions are less likely to vote for the far right. And that would mean, here we're speaking to the procedural component, as I defined it in 2 slides ago. And equally, individuals who positively assess institutional efficacy are less likely to opt for the far right, and that would be the substantive component of the social contract. So simply put, if you're happy with the system, you will reward the mainstream. If you're not happy with the system, you're more likely to punish the mainstream by opting for the far right. And here we take into consideration both the procedural component of trust and the social contract, which is broader support for institutions and trust in institutions, as well as the substantive component, which relates to institutional efficacy. Now, I mean, that's all and good, well and good, in the sense that there's quite a lot of literature that has looked at that already. The question is, what happens when we actually find some results, empirical results, where there is no association, or actually there is positive association? There are actually, under certain circumstances, we've seen in the literature, we may actually identify that citizens who are satisfied with democracy or various objects of political trust actually tend to opt for the far right. That's rather counterintuitive, based on the logic I put forward just now. How can we explain this? And here we sort of put forward this distinction between the protest voters that I just mentioned and the nationalists. There is a substantive electorate or portion of the electorate who form the core of far-right party support. These people, these individuals, tend to be much more ideological rather than strategic or protest voters, much more principled. And we know there's various literature that supports that the core far-right voter essentially is driven by feelings of nationalism, which we often see expressed in terms of anti-immigration attitudes. So essentially the point here is that there is a substantive, let's say, bedrock of opinion, anti-immigrant opinion, which is associated with support for the far right, essentially irrespective of political trust. The nationalists are less likely to take trust into consideration when casting their vote. For them, the core priority is the question of immigration, policies on immigration. So this is the prime factor that will come into their thinking when they opt for the far right, rather than protest. So as a result, what we're arguing is that trust, both procedurally speaking and substantively speaking, is likely to have no effect on far-right party support among core anti-immigrant voters. So to summarize, overall, trust has a positive effect. If you trust this, declining trust has a positive effect on far-right support. So if you support the system, you're less likely to opt for the far right. Yet this relationship does not hold if you are a core anti-immigrant voter of the far right. And hopefully this idea explains the divergence in terms of empirical results, because work so far has not differentiated between the two types of voter. So how do we proceed empirically? We test this idea using survey data. So we have used data from the European Social Survey. So this is a survey that is run in Europe across, every 2 years from the early 2000s onwards. It covers most European countries, but not all of them. And I should say that it does not always include the same countries across waves. That's not the problem of the European Social Survey per se, it's just that countries don't always opt in for a variety of reasons that I could go into explaining those in the Q&A. But in any case, we have essentially 19 European countries. We have 8 waves of this survey, so every 2 years from 2002 until 2016. And which brings us to quite a few parties, actually. And I have some slides on which parties we include in a moment, but it gives us a quite high sample size in terms of number of parties. So simply put, we are trying to predict for vote for the far right, and the European Social Survey has a question on that. I should say an advantage of the European Social Survey, apart from the fact that it's longitudinal, so you can capture long-term effects, is also that it has some core questions that are included in every wave. So the questions that we are using in our work are identically phrased across the waves, which provides extra validity and reliability in the findings. So what are we trying to predict? We're trying to predict support for the far right, or someone casting their vote for the far right in the national elections preceding the wave of the European Social Survey. And we're trying to do so as a function of these measures of the social contract. So here, as I said, we have, let's say, a quite broad definition, or all-encompassing definition of the social contract. We broke that down into procedural and substantive components. So when it comes to the procedural, we have created a scale of institutional trust, which includes people's levels of trust in the parliament, the legal system, the police, political parties, and so on. And then for the substantive component, we actually have 3 measures. We have a broad measure of institutional effectiveness, which is again a scale on how satisfied one is with the present state of the economy, the government, and the way democracy works in their country. And then we have 2 very specific policy questions, which is question about how do you think the state of health in your country is nowadays, and the same question about the state of education. So we've tried to do that in order to see, what's going on across different objects of trust, and also whether there is a difference between kind of broadly thinking about political trust in institutions, but also specifically when it comes to policy outcomes and public services. I mean, we have a number of controls. I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail, but we've got a lot of socio-demographic controls in our models, but also attitudes like immigration attitudes, left-right positions, feelings about your household income, and all these controls relate to classic theories of far-right voting. So what we're trying to do is to look at and examine and investigate the effect of trust, holding other potential explanations constant in our models. Our data have a hierarchical structure, which means that individuals are nested in countries, and essentially countries are nested in years, because we have a longitudinal perspective. We have opted to go for a logistic fixed effect model. This is because we are interested in essentially individual level variation rather than country level variation or time variation. So this kind of model essentially removes variation at the country year level and gives us the effects at the individual level. That said, we have run a lot of robustness checks with multi-level models, with only specific countries, with a different dependent variable, and so on. I can go into those in the Q&A, but I should say that what I will explain to you in a moment remains robust across model specification and various robustness checks. So moving on to the results, I've got, no, actually, sorry, before I move on to the results, I have a couple of tables showing to you which parties we have included. There are quite a lot of parties in the study. We have, I'm not going to read all of those, but I think you can see, and there's a second slide with the political parties. But the point here is that we've got a number of parties from many European countries. We vary in the inclusion. We have classic or more paradigmatic examples of the far right. Think about the Austrian Freedom Party that has been running for many years and is fairly successful. We've got parties in Belgium, Eastern Europe, the Golden Dawn in Greece, and so on. The United Kingdom Independence Party, all sorts of parties in the sample. Okay, so let's just look at the results. Now I've got a few figures here, and please do bear with me because I will explain those to you in a moment. So this is the first figure that basically gives you a very descriptive analysis of our data. So the first question one might have before you go into hypothesis testing is, are levels of trust or support for the social contract similar or dissimilar across different types of voters? So what I've done here is I have plotted the distribution on the four components of the social contract, and I compare the far right voters who are in the gray distribution to the non-far right voters who are the red distribution. So essentially the point is, are the red bars, the non-far right voters, more or less distrustful of the system? And this is just a descriptive question, but I think that's quite useful nonetheless. So we've done that for all four measures of trust. And I should remind you that 0, so the left of the x-axis means low levels of trust, and 10 means high levels of trust. What you can see, just eyeballing these four figures, is that levels of trust or the social contract in general do not vary dramatically across the two types of voters. Okay, so essentially the distributions follow each other quite nicely, especially in the procedural component, that is institutional effectiveness, state of health, and state of education. In the trust component, which is the broader diffuse support for the system, you see that the non-far right voters are slightly more trustworthy of the system, but again, there is no dramatic change. And equally, what you can see is that we have quite a lot of gray bars or people in the gray bars on the right-hand side of these figures, meaning that there are quite a few far-right voters who actually trust the system, something that perhaps we did not expect. It was not intuitive to us. So just to summarize the point that I'm trying to make with these figures is that there is some difference in terms of perceptions of the social contract across the two groups, the far-right voters and the non-far-right voters. But these differences, I mean, they are statistically significant. Let's not forget we have thousands of observations, but they're not dramatic. So that tells us something already, that, well, okay, maybe trust will matter in a different way. In terms of testing our expectations, what we found is when it comes to the first hypothesis with regards to the overall effects of trust on far-right voting, we actually did find support of that. This is through our models. I'm not going to show you our models now, but I have the paper. If someone wants to read it, I can share it. But generally what we found is that basically both with regards to the procedural and the substantive components of the social contract, trust in institutions, institutional effectiveness, positive assessments of the state of health and education generally mean that people are less likely to opt for the far right. The flip side of that is, of course, if we have declining levels of trust, we have more higher probabilities for support of the far right, which means that if you take trust and the social contract and you just test it, generally on the whole, what you will find is a confirmation of this protest mechanism thesis. And I should say that one advantage of our data is that they cover a lot of years and they cover a lot of parties. So there is quite a lot to be said about the reliability of our findings. Now, what happens with the second question or the second assumption, which relates to the nationalists, right? What do the nationalists do? How does the effect of trust and perceptions of the social contract feature amongst the nationalists? So to do that, we move on in a slightly more statistically complicated procedure, which is interaction effects. So what we've done here is we have essentially interacted immigration attitudes with the four components of the social contract. We have used immigration attitudes as a proxy for the core electorate, considering that those individuals with strong anti-immigration attitudes are very, very likely, we know that from the literature, to opt for the far right. And essentially what I'm showing you here is the average marginal effects of each measure of the social contract at different levels of immigration. So just to make it a bit clearer, this line here ranges from 0, 0 is the person that is fully anti-immigrant, and 10 is the person that is fully pro-immigrant. Okay, and what you show here is basically the effect of the average marginal effect of trust at different levels of immigration. Okay, so what you do find is that indeed, from someone that scores 3 to someone that scores 10, the effect of trust on support for the far right is actually negative, meaning, going back to our original hypothesis, that if you trust the system, you're not going to opt for the far right. You're less likely to opt for the far right. What we do find as well is that if you score 1 or 2, so quite anti-immigrant, actually there is no effect, which supports our our second set of hypotheses. And what interestingly we find is that if you are scoring 0, and actually there's quite a few individuals that score 0, there is a positive effect. So if you do trust the system and you are extremely anti-immigrant, you're more likely to opt for the far right even more. It will even amplify your probability of opting for the far right. Now, the pattern is sort of similar, but not identical in all other components. When it comes to institutional effectiveness, essentially you see a negative effect across most immigration scores, apart from 0, where there is no effect. And I think the interesting thing comes here, actually, because when it comes to health and education, what you do see is that from about 4 to 5, so the middle point-ish onwards, the relationship is negative. But actually, the anti-immigrant people, they have a positive relationship, and some have a no effect relationship. So what does this tell you? It tells you that, on the whole, trust is actually negatively related with support for the far right. Okay, and that is a very robust finding. However, under certain circumstances, the people who are extremely anti-immigrant might actually be the effect of their anti-immigrant attitudes might even become more amplified if they trust the system, which is a very interesting finding. It's not something that is partly what we expected in terms of the no effect, but partly what we didn't expect in terms of the positive effect amongst some groups, which is rather interesting because it perhaps requires further investigation. So as individuals are more pro-immigrant, then trust matters negatively, but there are also some positive and some no effects amongst the anti-immigrant. So to conclude, what I've tried to show in my presentation is that overall, the theories that are examining the role of political trust in terms of voting behavior, they can be confirmed. Yes, political trust essentially dissuades people from opting for more marginal, more anti-establishment parties, specifically the far right. However, the relationship is not exactly the same for core far right party supporters. Actually, the mechanism there is different. It's either the case that trust has no effect, which is in line with our second hypothesis, and under some small circumstances, we'd actually see a positive effect, which is rather interesting because one could say that actually, I mean, we do know that nationalist individuals prioritize a distinction between the in-group and the out-group. And perhaps if they do perceive well-functioning institutions, they want to keep that for the in-group in a way. But this relationship becomes amplified amongst a very small section of the population. More broadly, what we're trying to show here is that there are two routes with regards to far-right voting. There is the protest mechanism, the discontent, the strategic kind of mechanism, and these are the people who might opt for the far-right in one election, but not opt for the far-right in another election, depending on their assessments of the political system. And then, of course, there is the more ideological, the more principled support or route for support of the far right. Now, why is this important? I mean, I'm just going to say that, and I want to leave that to the discussion. But essentially, this differential effect of trust points to what we think is a very important democratic trade-off, because high levels of trust in institutions are indeed a very good thing for democracy, simply because, from a normative perspective, simply because empirically it does limit its mobilizational capacity. However, they could even have the opposite effect among some very specific individuals. They could have a galvanizing effect. So for policymakers, it would be useful to find ways to balance between those two. Thank you.
Gosh, thanks so much, Professor Vasilopoulou, for telling us the very latest research on what you've been researching recently in terms of discontentment and ideology and the far right. It's now time for me to pass over to Professor Dimitris Papadimitriou, who's going to be chairing our questions. We've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. So, Dimitris,
right.
over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thanks, Paul. A really fascinating paper. I will perhaps kick off the first question myself. I always kind of abuse my position like this in these seminars. There are quite a few interesting questions on the board too, which I'll come back to in a minute. My question is, when you were looking at the indicators of procedural trust to democracy, you included education and the economy in there. But not law and order, which I would have expected to be a big thing for right-wing voters, or indeed immigration. I mean, I know that subsequently you use immigration as a proxy to do this relational analysis, but that is a little bit, it puzzled me a little bit, in the same way that the trust, overall trust to the system, it did not seem to include trust in the media. And we do know, of course, that many right-wing voters have a thing about the media, right? Not to mention names here. So that is something that puzzled me a little bit. And a related point, which is this distinction between a protester and a nationalist. I would be very interested to perhaps for you to elaborate a little bit more. What are the key attributes of these two archetypes, as it were, and what happens in your analysis when somebody is both a protester and a nationalist? So what does that do to your hypothesis, in other words?
Am I muted? No.
Okay. You're free to go.
Yes, so thanks. These are very useful questions. With regards to your first question, I should say that why not law and order? There's no specific, well, let me just start from the beginning. The substantive component is meant to capture how people view policy outcomes. And in that sense, you're very right to highlight that we have been selective in our approach. And in a very simple way, we are constrained by our data. There's no questions on what you just said. There's no question on how do you see the state of law and order in your society. The only questions are education and health. So, and in a way, that's a contribution in itself because no one else has looked at them. There's certainly no, the question that there is on immigration is about attitudes to immigration. It's not about policy outcomes. Perhaps this would be related, but that's, I think, an empirical question. The media, again, doesn't feature, but I am pretty sure that the media will correlate highly with general institutional trust, e.g. parliament, legal system, police, politicians, and parties. And what we've done here, this is the procedural component, meaning how does the procedures of our democracy work. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. And when you scale them together, you get a Cronbach's alpha, which is 0.89, which is a very strong correlation. So I don't see any reason why the media would change that massively. But I think it would be rather useful to have a question on law and order, I agree. But yeah, this is not feasible, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to the key attributes, I'm sorry, of the two types of voters, sort of the starting point here is a combination of the theories of voting behavior for the far right, and also theories of the types of policy agendas that far right parties put forward. And starting from the latter, we know that the core ideological characteristics of the far right relate to populism and generally liberalism in liberal politics. And we relate that to the protester type of voter. And then the second, perhaps the most important, is nationalism and the immigration, this kind of thing, which we relate to the nationalist voter. So this is the distinction. What we do know from the literature is that both types of attitudes, so both populist attitudes and nationalistic attitudes or anti-immigration attitudes, are related to the vote for the far right. What we're sort of arguing is that for the core electorate, meaning the strong anti-immigrant voters, immigration is more important than protest. I think this is what we're trying to show in a way, so that essentially they will opt for the far right regardless of how they see the political system. And what you do find is that there is a small minority of individuals who are anti-immigrant, but actually have a fairly positive view of the system, which is in a way counterintuitive, but practically what we're arguing is that the trust in the system doesn't come into the equation for these very strong anti-immigrant individuals.
Sure. So yeah, that in a way may be the type of anti-immigration candidate in the north of the European, a Finn or a German, that they do trust the system, but they don't like immigrants, right? Whereas somebody in Spain or in Greece, they don't trust the system, they don't like immigrants, they become protesters.
Indeed, and actually we have done some analysis along these lines, but I didn't want to present too much information. And what you actually see is that, I mean, I'm simplifying here, but in countries of the north, you don't really see declining levels overall in the political system. You see fairly supportive levels of the political system, which are above average, and the line is sort of flat over time. It doesn't change dramatically. Right. Whereas you go to, as you say, to Spain, Greece, and the line starts sort of in the middle and then drops.
Right. Very clear.
Yeah, which also comes, I don't know if I can make one additional point, which also comes to sort of explain this other puzzle, which is basically, we usually expect far-right parties to rise during sort of immigration type of concerns, which has happened in the north. But in the south, in Greece, for instance, we saw the rise of the Golden Dawn during an economic crisis. But the Golden Dawn does not, or parties such as the Golden Dawn, do not offer an economic solution to the problem, right?
Sure.
Yet they still did really well. So there's something there to be said, perhaps, too.
That's great. Let me just pass on some questions from the audience. From one from Saden or Caden, I'm not sure. I apologize in advance if I misspelled that name. What would you say about this hypothesis? Levels of government trust in European countries, such as the UK, France, Italy, Spain, will decrease after the poor handling of coronavirus, and therefore far-right support will increase.
Well, yes and no, I should say. And I think one thing to say is that levels of trust generally fluctuate. Okay, in some countries they fluctuate more than others. Now, the health crisis is slightly different to the immigration or the refugee crisis, as it were, because the health crisis has to do directly with competence of addressing the health issue in the here and now. And incidentally, because of COVID, we had lower levels of immigration, in the sense that people cannot move as freely as they were before. So I cannot exclude this possibility, but certainly in the short to medium term, I think the advantage, the electoral advantage, lies with mainstream parties, because it is a question of competence. Right. In the longer run, if the health crisis somehow becomes transformed into yet another economic crisis, perhaps in countries like Spain, you might see that. But so I think we need to differentiate between kind of short and long-term effects as well.
That's great. That's great. A question from Konstantinos here, which is about the social contract and the extent to which you feel that your findings point to a direction where the social contract that has bound many European countries needs to be renegotiated somehow?
I mean, that's an excellent question. This is the $1 million question. I wish I had an answer to that. I mean, to some extent, the answer is yes, because, I mean, talking a bit more broadly than the paper itself, there is certainly the case of a perceived breach to the social contract. It varies across countries, indeed, but there is that feeling, and there was certainly that feeling in the South, and we've done quite a lot of work in the South, and I think certainly in the South it is the case. Now the question is, how do policymakers renegotiate such a contract? And if our findings are correct, the problem is that even if you do renegotiate the contract, for some people it will have sort of a limiting capacity. It will limit the mobilization of these people, which would have a negative effect on the far right, on support for the far right. But for some others, it might work the other way, right? So if a policymaker would wish to renegotiate the social contract and thereby address the rise of the far right, they will probably have to address questions that relate to immigration in one way or another as well. So I don't think these two should be negotiated independent of one another.
I guess that answers another question that has come forward, which is another $1 million question here, which is how do mainstream parties go about regaining the trust of those who are left out or feel left out?
Yes. Well, I think certainly that will depend from one country to another, because a solution that will be appropriate, let's say, in the context of South European politics or Greek politics or Spanish politics may not necessarily be exactly the same, let's say, when it comes to the North. And because we talked about the question of immigration in the economy, clearly what we've seen with the Euro crisis and in its aftermath is that the crisis was really more of a in-group versus out-group crisis up in the north, whereas it was more of a really economic and financial crisis in the south. So I think certainly that would lend to the idea that there cannot be one size fits all sort of answer.
A very sensible answer. I have one more question, but I don't know if Paul wants to come in. We don't want to leave our chair out of this discussion, you know, because she will tell me off afterwards.
No, go ahead, question master. That's all good.
No, it's nothing to do with that. I just have a final question, if I may, because I find the argument very convincing. In many ways, I found what you've left out even more convincing, which is more interesting, rather, which is trying to explain this paradox of belief in the system and at the same time distrust of policy outcomes on immigration. And this, to me, at least listening to what you said today, I find a lot of value in this, in differentiating kind of status quo challenges from the north and the south of Europe, because that's something that have always puzzled me in that respect. But I'm also, in a way, very disappointed, I have to say, about the availability of data, the European Social Survey, that does not include law and order or immigration. And my naive question to you is, how do we go about, as researchers, bypassing this really big problem? Because I know, for example, that Eurostat, the European Union Statistical Agency, trace attitudes on law and order and on immigration. So could these things be combined, perhaps, or would it not work methodologically?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're totally right. I should say the European Social Survey is probably one of the best surveys for our purposes. There are many others that are not as satisfactory. So this is the most satisfactory in the context of what we're trying to do. Now, how the questions work is that there are some standard questions that have been negotiated by the team for about 20 years ago, and they keep on running, which include classic questions such as immigration attitudes or sociodemographics and so on. And then if you want to, if you as a researcher, or we as researchers, we have a very specific idea of a new question or a new set of questions, we essentially make a case for that to the European Social Survey. It's kind of like a tender process, and they choose one every 2 or 3 years to include. It's not very easy, because in the sense that there's a lot of competition. These are very expensive surveys, right? But this is kind of how it works. So there was a module on immigration maybe 6-7 years ago. There was a module on the environment. There was a module meaning special set of questions. Yeah. There's one on social justice most recently. But I should say, even if we do have that, let's say on law and order and various other issues, that is clearly an advantage, but you don't have the longitudinal component. So there's always a trade-off, as it were. So even if you do manage to put forward your questions, which is a very successful outcome, considering the levels of competition, still you will essentially trade off the longitudinal perspective. So it depends what you as a researcher prefer in terms of what will make your argument more sensible in terms of testing it. What was the other question? There was another point. You cannot combine different surveys because you don't have the same respondents, so that's problematic. You can only do it at the aggregate level. And I think one very important question with the European Social Survey is that not all countries participate all the time. And that is a problem, because for quite a few countries, this is a political decision. So, which politics should not really come into academia, but there you go. So I know some countries that have barely participated in the European Social Survey. I'm not going to name them, but if you go online, you will have a look and you can see for themselves. And there are some other countries that always participate. So there is some politics behind it as well. And politics not necessarily something sort of on purpose, but for some governments, this is just simply not important.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks ever so much. I'll pass you back to you, Paul.
Okay, well, thanks, Dimitris, for sharing that. And we had a couple more questions pop in at the end, which we'll forward on to you, Sophia, after the end of the talk. Just before we thank Professor Vasilopoulou for her presentation today, can I just mention that we have a final Jean Monnet seminar in 2 weeks' time with Luis Chimon from Vrije Universiteit Bruxelles in Brussels, who's going to be talking about European foreign policy in regards to China and the USA. But for now, please all join me in thanking our fantastic speaker and my former PhD supervisor, Professor Sophia Vasilopoulou. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.